if you don't have a property or a currency with which you can store economic energy, that's like being a type 1 diabetic. You cannot store fat on your body. It means that you can eat as much as you want. You will literally starve to death. You know, inflation and diversification are both bromides. There are these simplistic terms that people toss around, but no one really thinks very deeply about them in my experience. I mean, let's start with inflation. Inflation is not 2%. Inflation is not the CPI. It's not 7.5%. Inflation, properly understood, is simply the rate at which the price of anything appreciates in the currency, which is the frame of reference, which means that you can calculate an inflation rate for a Picasso painting, which is different than a building in New York, which is different than a bond, which is different than a market basket of goods and services that you wish to buy, which is different than the market basket of goods and services I want to sell you. So what's the real inflation rate? It's a vector. Once you understand that, you realize that there's probably two inflation rates of interest. One inflation rate is the rate at which cost of living is going up for a middle-class family. That's not the CPI, because the CPI is a manipulated market basket set by a politician or a bureaucrat that is engineered not to go up in price very fast. Most average people would find that their inflation rate is higher than the CPI. And if, for example, we don't include the cost of buying a home in the CPI, even though it stands to reason that just about any reasonable person would want to buy a house at some point in their life. So you can calculate a consumer inflation rate, which is different than CPI, but you can also calculate an asset inflation rate. That's the cost of getting rich or staying rich. If you want to be wealthy, it's not good enough to keep up with CPI. You have to actually keep up with the rate at which assets are appreciating, right? The cost of housing went up 18.8% year over year. But if you look at the S&P index, which is a market basket of desirable companies, that gives you a surrogate for a monetary inflation rate. The monetary inflation rate's been running 7 to 10% a year in the US at the same time that the CPI has been running 1%. If you understood that, you understand that your cost of capital is more like 10%, which meant that any investment you made that didn't yield 10% was making you poorer. You were losing wealth. Any business person understands that. I couldn't get you to accept a 2% ROI on an investment. So if you understand inflation's a vector, then you start to realize that the inflation rate in Miami Beach is different than it is in Kansas City. And you understand that the inflation rate, if you want to stay wealthy, is much higher. The inflation rate in 2020 was about 25% for assets. The inflation rate for bonds was at one point higher. So once you understand inflation is a vector, then you stop paying attention to just one cherry-picked number, because what you realize is I can manufacture any inflation rate you want simply by adjusting the market basket of products and services. And by definition, if I never include assets in the market basket of desirable goods, then you will always ignore asset inflation, which is the most pernicious inflation. So we have had hyperinflation since 1971, but the inflation has manifested itself in the assets. And here's the pernicious thing about it. I've literally brainwashed you into thinking that asset inflation isn't a bad thing, it's a good thing, and it isn't inflation at all. It's actually investment gain, right? So that's when I convince you that a bad thing is a good thing, right? We've come to a bizarre point. So we're living in inflation since we went off the gold standard. It manifests in the assets. We have hyperinflation right now. It's just manifesting itself in the assets more so than in the goods and services. Now, if you go to diversification, it's another bromide. A lot of times the people that say that to you want you to give them your money, right? It's like I'm a hedge fund manager, and so I'm going to stand up and tell you need a broadly diversified portfolio of like international equities and domestic equities and like some of these commodities, and it changes all the time. It's very complicated. It's too complicated for you to figure out, so you just give me your money. I'm going to charge you a 2% fee, keep 20% of the upside, and I'm going to invest it in this hyper-complicated array, diversification of stuff, right? I'll give you a simple idea. Go buy Bitcoin. Don't give me anything. I don't want your money. I don't want the 2%. I don't want 20% of the upside. And Bitcoin is a diversified index of the entire world economy, and certainly the crypto economy as it comes to its senses. You can believe one thing or the other thing. You can imagine if you're in the business of managing people's money, the last thing you want to do is tell them the answer is just buy this one thing and hold it for 100 years. How do I make money off of that? Right? On the other hand, what's the problem with diversification? Well, first of all, the problem with diversification is selling the winner to buy the losers. And the second problem with diversification is you're not really diversified at all because everything you own is probably correlated to one currency, which is collapsing. If you own Apple stock in the year 2010, a mutual fund manager or a hedge fund manager would tell you he's going to diversify you because when Apple stock doubles, he's going to sell some of that so he can buy some HP or some Dell or some other IBM or some other computer company. And when Apple doubles again, he's going to sell some more to keep you diversified in the computer sector because he wouldn't want you to have too much exposure to Apple. The problem with that is that at one point, Apple became 150% of all the profit in the entire mobile phone industry. That is to say, the winner eats everybody. Not only does it eat everybody, everyone competing against Apple is losing money to compete against Apple. So you're selling the winner to buy the losers. When you have a dominant digital monopoly, the digital monopoly eats everything else, and Apple Computer is the most valuable company in the world because Apple Computer is literally the most valuable company in the world. They can ship a product to 1 billion people over the weekend for a nickel, and their competitors can't. So selling the winner to buy the loser is an awful strategy. The only people that made money in the stock market in the last decade were the people that owned FANG. They owned Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. There's no diversification here at all. So if you're investing in a stable currency, you have to keep in mind that digital monopolies are dominant and they crush everything else, and everything else goes to zero. So now here's the other problem. I'm going to put you in Venezuela. Okay, so you're in Venezuela and you have a choice. You can buy one company in Venezuela or the entire index of Venezuelan stocks, or you can buy one building in Venezuela or all the buildings in Venezuela, or you can buy one bond in Venezuela or all the Venezuelan bonds. Give me a diversification strategy which is going to actually keep you from losing all your money over 5 years if you're sitting in Venezuela 5 years ago. What is it? They're all correlated. When the currency collapses, the bonds collapse that are linked to the currency. All the companies that generate cash flows in the currency, they all collapse because they're valued as a stream of cash flows. And if the cash is worthless, how is the company going to be valuable? So the problem is every equity, every piece of debt, every piece of property linked to the currency is correlated to the currency. So your diversification strategy with any given currency, whether it's the peso, the dollar, the euro, the ruble, the lira, the whatever, they're all correlated. So then you're like, okay, well, this is great. I'm just going to buy the dollar. All the currencies are correlated to the dollar, and the dollar's collapsing. So ultimately, the problem with diversification is nearly everything, every stock is correlated, and every conventional asset is generally correlated. The only true diversification is if you find non-sovereign stores of value that have that derive their value based upon something other than the cash flows that you could derive from them, right? So, think hard about what those are. Pristine trophy properties might protect you, but I think I think that the problem ultimately is if you're on a sinking ship, you have to get off the ship. And the problem with diversification, like when you're in the retail industry and when it's completely getting obliterated by Amazon, you have to get off. You have to get out. There's no winning strategy, no matter how you diversify in. And so most of the time, these models, inflation is 2% or CPI, and we should stay diversified, they're based upon this very conventional wisdom that I live in this safe world and nothing has changed.